Okay, welcome back. This is our chapter one notes video. This is part two. Like I said at the beginning of the first one, I did listen to feedback from the first Intro to Criminal Justice class that talked about maybe breaking up these longer lecture videos into smaller parts. So apologies, they're still going to be long, but I will break them up smaller so that you can take a break, and I'll try to pick the most natural place for it. So anyway, last time I left you with the thought about how we approach children in the criminal justice system, and I think that that's a good kind of question to think about, and we'll probably be thinking about that type of question the entire semester or the entire 8 week session. So, thinking about all those things that we talked about in the last one, is there any hope for children? Like, should we even try to help them, or is it a lost cause and we just need to give up on them? Hint, hint. No, we are not giving up on them. So, what I want you to remember and think about, despite all the negative pieces that we talked about, so, poverty, divorce, the foster care system, educational problems, while those are still big issues and they are across the board, there have been improvements in the last 20, 30 years. Like, there has been a push to get things better. And so we do see these numbers getting a little bit better, but there's always more we can do. And I encourage you to think about this, and you can agree with me or disagree with me completely. This is one of the few times where you get my opinion, and this is my honest opinion as a teacher, not as a person, as a teacher. I believe that everybody has the ability and the right to achieve their dreams. They can do it. And that's not to say, well, I dream I'm going to be a millionaire. That's not going to happen. That's not what I mean. I mean that truly you can do amazing things. And I just urge you never to give up on that. And so, for me personally, as a teacher, getting a student who struggles to understand one concept, seeing them finally get something is the biggest thing for me. That makes me the most happy. It really does. It's not to say students that do well in my class don't make me happy. I enjoy students that do really well. But when I see a student who struggles do an amazing job on something, that fills me with happiness and hope, because it shows that no matter what situation you are in, you can do better. And so, not any names. Before I was teaching at EC3, I had a student in one of my classes who was one of these individuals who came from a divorced family, who had low education, barely passed high school, and their writing level was that of an eighth grader as a freshman in college. They couldn't write, well, actually, I would say it was about sixth grade, because they couldn't really write a complete sentence. It was a real problem. But I worked with this student every day outside of class. This was during, actually, before COVID happened, so when we went remote, I would video chat with him every night after he got home from work, and I would help him through this process. And by the end of the class, he was able to write a junior year of high school level paper. And I was so proud of that student. They did so good. And that meant a lot, because this was a student who never really had that support and struggled. And someone that was just willing to put in the time and effort to get to know them, to help them, made a world of difference. And so, if you ever wonder, Mr. Wheaton, why the heck do you teach all these weird different classes, and why do you... I do it because I love to make a difference in someone's life. It doesn't have to be big, but I love that. Fun follow up, I ran into that student a couple months ago randomly at Walmart, and they were super excited to see me and came up and gave me a hug. It was really nice. But I mean this, nobody is beyond saving. So Is there reason for us to hope that we can change this and help reduce juveniles who are part of the criminal justice system because they've committed crime? Yes. I fully believe that we can make an impact. It's just going to take a lot of work and a lot of patience. All right. So this is where I get to say juvenile delinquency. And I guess I should write this now. Um, Delinquency. So, the title of our textbook, but it's also a key term that we need to know. What the heck is juvenile delinquency? And our textbook even tells us participation in illegal behavior by a minor who falls under a statutory age limit. Delinquency is breaking the rules, breaking the law. Juvenile means that you're breaking it and you're under a set age that you need to be. Boom. All right, close the textbook. We're done with the class. Just kidding. Please don't. But it's important to note that's what we're talking about. So, according to our author, about 1.7 million youths under the age of 18 are arrested each year for crimes ranging from the most minimal things of loitering to the most extreme murder. So, yes, technically, if you decide to just hang out in front of a store because that's just what you do and you happen to be under the age of 18, you are loitering and you can be charged with that. And if you're a juvenile, that means you can be put in the juvenile system, and that's a whole another kettle of fish. So it's important to know that. Another thing just to note, this is kind of a repeat of something that we saw in Intro to Criminal Justice, but it's important to mention it here. We have this issue of chronic offenders. Here we just put juvenile in the middle, so chronic juvenile offenders. A chronic offender is a repeat offender, someone who continually does the same crime over and over and over and over again. This is the person that does not or does continue to repeat the recidivism rate. They keep just going, yeah, I stole from that house. Okay, I'm in jail. All right, I'm out. I'm going to steal from that house now. Stop doing it. But any kind of chronic offenders are just people who continually either repeat the same offense or a similar offense, that sort of thing. But an interesting thing to note, youths who have been arrested 4 or more times during their age under the limit, their quote-unquote minority, they tend to continue and even go towards a more serious crime at some point. So there is a correlation. The more you do a crime, the more likely you are going to move up to a next level crime and as well continue that pattern as you get older. So this is a list of questions that our text puts forward, and I'm just going to ask them. We're not going to answer them necessarily because we kind of can't answer it, but so thinking about causes of delinquency, juvenile delinquency, and thinking about ways to fix it, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, might be something we'd look at. Is delinquency a function of psychological abnormality, a reaction against destructive social conditions, the product of a disturbed home? Does serious delinquent behavior occur only in urban areas among lower class youths, or is it spread throughout the social structure? What are the effects of family life, substance abuse, school experiences, and peer relations? And it's important to note that some of that we can't answer. Number one, it's not just the poor. There are individuals who are of affluent families who commit some kind of crime, and that's not good. They're equally juvenile delinquents. Same can be said for environment. The classic psychological nature versus nurture. Your environment that you are raised in will have an impact on who you are. It'll have an impact of how you respond and how you interact with individuals. So there is something to environment, and I'm going to continue to bring in psychology issues because if you remember in that first lecture video, I already said we're going to talk a lot about philosophy, psychology. Oh, I didn't say philosophy. We're going to talk a lot about psychology and sociology, but we are going to talk a little bit about philosophy. So, like, the juvenile system is not just criminal justice, it is so much more. And so, we are going to talk about that as well. So, the ultimate question of our juvenile justice system is how should police deal with minors who break the law, who violate the law? And if you took Intro to Criminal Justice with me, you will remember my wonderful children were seen as mini adults. And that is part of the history, and we are going to touch on that here in a minute. But that's the ultimate question. How do we? Oh gosh, why did that not work? How do we deal with juvenile delinquents? No, I want my pen. Sorry. So, this is the ultimate question that we are going to come back to time and again throughout this class. That's part of the focus of this textbook. That's the focus of this class, is understanding how the juvenile justice system works. And its entire premise is focused on this one concept. So, if there was one thing you take away from this class, from this multi-video lecture, I don't know if it's going to be 3 parts or 2 parts, but this is the question. How do we deal with juvenile delinquents? So, now we're going to dive a little bit into the history of the system itself, just so that we can touch those bases, and then we're going to, before I dive into that, because we are going to talk about it, I want to write down something so that I don't forget. And again, if you took Intro to Criminal Justice, you've already familiar with this concept. And it's going to be punishment versus rehabilitation, and we will talk about that in depth. So this is the sit back and listen to me talk. This is not going to be major things, but childhood as a concept of an era of your life where you're supposed to be innocent and enjoy things and learn about the world. That is not something that we've had forever. You can go all the way back to pretty much the Middle Ages and even further back. There wasn't a childhood. Children were the property of the parent, and specifically the father, and the father had all say, and there was no juvenile justice system. There was no justice system, really. So in the medieval times and all that kind of stuff, it would become further down the line mentorship style, but you can even go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. This idea of mentorship where young boys, when they were old enough to, do activities, so like 6 years old usually, and that's a scary thought, they would work out in the fields with their father and learn how to plow and learn how to do all these other things. And the young girls would stay in the household with their mother and learn how to wash, sew, cook, all that other stuff. So this was how children, and I put air quotes around that, were treated. They were mini adults. That was history for such a long time. Children were just meant to be mini adults. They didn't get paid, or they didn't get paid nearly as much because, well, they're little adults. They don't need it. Education wise is a little weird. Um, some, depending on the role that young boys would go into, would either have some proper schooling or just some kind of mentorship program. But young girls would be educated at home by their mother in how to raise a home and keep a home and all that other stuff. So there wasn't really childhood and there wasn't really anything in place for children. And so eventually, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, there were some things that were put in place to help children. And I put that in air quotes as well because it was a step in the right direction, but still not quite there. So the family structure, well, the Middle Ages were, the father was the head and ruled and it was in charge of everything. Um, there was a change from the man teaches the boys and the girl teaches the girl, or the wife teaches the girls. It actually ended up becoming more of that, the wife taught the young children all the important skills, and then when the boy was old enough, he'd go to an actual school or, again, mentorship programming. So that was a change at this time. Um, it's part of the Enlightenment, if you're familiar with those terms for eras in history. Like I said, these are not super important to know. These are just understanding that childhood itself is a newer concept. Another thing that kind of came up that was important is poor laws. So around 1535 ish, the English, because all of our modern policing stuff comes in some way, shape, or form from the British. Sorry to tell you that. But they had poor laws. The idea was that, poor laws were designed to have a response for individuals who could not afford things. But it was the destitute. That's the term that they used. The destitute, the neglected. But what it ended up coming down to was, children of poor or homeless would become servants in affluent houses. And they were trained to do certain things, so they would be house servants and things of that sort. And then, as always, we have the mentorship, apprenticeship kind of programming. That's a common thing throughout our history. Um, so, as I said, the apprenticeship movement that went from there was a shift between that's just what you did to you could go into it, so it was more voluntary. Sometimes there was a fee. It all depends. But one thing that we did talk about in Intro to Criminal Justice is Latin phrase parens patriae, and I'm just going to write that down here for you. This is probably the only thing from this history section that I'm going to ever bring up on a test or quiz. Parens patriae. The reason I say this is because it's still relevant within our own system. Because the idea behind this is that the power of the state is to act on behalf of the child and provide care equivalent to that of a parent. So essentially, it's if the parent can't take care of the child, the government, the local community, they should be responsible for providing adolescents who don't have that with that kind of responsibility. And so that's why I said this might be the only thing that might come up in a quiz or exam. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Learn it. Okay. So, like I said, throughout history, we've not really had a childhood, and the power structure of who's in charge of a child has always been usually within the family. But as we get further and further, around the mid 19th century is when we finally started developing the juvenile system. Specifically here in America, the juvenile justice system. It was nowhere near what it is now, but it was, the first steps in understanding that children are different. They are not mini adults. They are not, they should not be put in prison with an adult. because this was a reality. You could have a 9-year-old individual who stole being put in prison with a 57-year-old who stole. And I don't know about you, but if I put a child and an adult next to each other in a locked room in prison where the adult has not had any kind of sexual intercourse for a while, I'm just saying there gets to be a really creepy line of pedophilia that I'm not okay with at all. Nor should anyone be okay with pedophilia because it's really wrong, but this is a problem. Yeah, let's just put them together. Not a good idea. So we had to start developing different systems, different courts, different places to place children. And so this started around this time. It wouldn't get nearly to where it was until more modern times, but it's important to note that historically speaking, juveniles were just treated as adults within the system until we finally hit a point where we're like, no, 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 they're different. So something that I do want to talk about though with this, so first off, the 19th century, in case you're not familiar, would be the 1800s. I know it gets confusing, especially when you're not thinking about this often. Whatever the century is, minus one from that number, and that's the years that you're in. We are in the 21st century, but we are not in 2122. We are in 2022. So just remember, whatever century we're in, minus one, that's the year that you start with. So anyway, we're talking the 1800s, and they definitely use this parens patriae model when they finally started developing the courts. But at the same time, something else was going on at this point in history. And those of you that aren't familiar with our world history or local history, and when I say local, I mean United States, not Erie, Pennsylvania. But this was a time of the Industrial Revolution where we were urbanizing, where we went from farms to cities. And because of this, there was a push to accommodate individual youths who were delinquents or homeless or whatever. And so all of a sudden they started developing these places, two particular things, and I'm going to explain this a little bit. We have workhouses and we have almshouses. And so an almshouse, just to explain, is a poorhouse, a place where people who do not have a home and live on the streets would be forced to live. And this can also be where they're taken care of, and I put that in air quotes, and die. It's not a pleasant place. And the other one is the workhouse. And a workhouse is literally just a building with just cots, and you go there to sleep, and when you're not sleeping there, you're going to work at the company that has the workhouse. This was seen as a way of taking care of the children, making sure that they are not homeless, that they have a job, that they're being taken care of. But hindsight is 2020, and looking back at these things, a lot of research historians and whatnot look back and go, they weren't really doing it for the children. They were doing it because, well, you can pay a child a lot less in labor fees than you can an adult. And so it was a shady practice, but it is important to note that these were things that were developed not just for the poor and the homeless, but also for children at this time in history. So eventually we got better. Realistically, by about the 1900s, that's when we started to actually have formal locations where juveniles could be housed and that kind of thing that weren't almshouses. But where I kind of want to go with this, because like I said, we don't really need to dive into the whole history. The chapter does plenty of that, and you can do that as well. But the Illinois Juvenile Court Act of 1899, and this is kind of like, despite all of the reform groups and everything that came before, they were like, we need to parent children and the government needs to do this. And remember that children at this time also didn't have due process, and that's a whole nother issue. But this all came down to the Illinois Juvenile Court Act. And so their whole argument broke down to four pieces, and this can be found on page 18 of the textbook. And that is that number one, children should not be held as accountable as adult transgressors. Let me repeat that. Children should not be held as accountable as adult transgressors. This is an issue we still have today. And that's why I want to emphasize that this was 1899 and we are still debating how impactful this is. Number two, the objective of the juvenile justice system is to treat and rehabilitate rather than punishment. Oh my gosh, I have it written right here. Punishment versus rehabilitation. Again, things that we are still talking about well over 100 years later. Number three, disposition should be predicated on analysis of the youth's special circumstances and needs. Those are just very fancy words for saying that any kind of decision made about them in a court should consider what they need and any kind of circumstances they have. So if there is, no home, mental health, whatever, these are things that need to be considered when we talk about actual punishments. And then the system, this is the fourth thing, the system should avoid the trappings of the adult criminal process with all its confusing rules and procedures. And so this fourth one, and why I wanted to talk about all these right now, is that the fourth one has a little bit of a problem. This is what put up the concept that in the juvenile court system, you do not have, juvenile doesn't have the same rights because, well, they don't need him because it's not the same and they don't need to be held to the same rules. So they don't need due process and they don't need, and that's where the issue comes up, at least when referring to that. So the legacy itself of the Illinois Juvenile Court Act is that it really did emphasize the difference that children are not mini adults. They are, in fact, adolescents, and we need to consider their cases individually rather than a blanket kind of covering. And again, Intro to Criminal Justice, we do talk about how we set a precedent on how we approach cases. Well, in juvenile system, we have precedents, but at the same time, we have to approach every case differently. So, sorry, just wanted to make sure that I touched on those things. All right. So, with this idea of parens patriae, the big takeaway of this is not only are they acting as a parent, but this means that they are acting in the best interest of the youth, of the adolescent. That's just my way of saying we need to remember this. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. If I, as a general note, just side note for anyone listening that has not had me before, if I repeat something several times, it means it's important and it's going to show up later. So if you're listening to these lectures and you're like, he's talked about parens patriae like 5 times now, that means it's important and it's going to show up. So yeah, that's just my little hint to you about how to be a good college student. And so it's also important to note that juvenile delinquency, let me put it this way. I have to think about how I want to phrase things sometimes because I don't want to say it the wrong way, and I want to make sure that it makes sense when I talk about it. So in Intro to Criminal Justice, we talk about there are really 2 different types of courts and 2 different types of crimes. I I use that with air quotes because obviously crime is criminal, but it's criminal law versus civil law. It's one or the other. If it's criminal, it affects all of society. If it's civil, it affects an individual. Delinquency falls between these two. It is its own separate thing that acts as this weird in between. And the reason I say that is some of the crimes that are considered delinquent, and we did talk about this in Intro to Criminal Justice, is because the individual is under the age of 18 because they are a youth. So things like, and this is the big controversial one, and we are going to talk about it today or in this video or whatever, curfew. Oh wait, I spelled that wrong. Where's my eraser? Sorry. Sometimes I get caught up in my writing and I forget to spell things right. There we go, curfew. This is a controversial piece, and we will talk a little bit about curfew and why it is controversial, especially in the juvenile justice system. But delinquent crimes are things like this: curfew, not showing up to school. Like, these are crimes because of your age. It has nothing to do if it's criminal or civil. It's this weird in-between area. And so, if you really like talking about criminal versus civil type of stuff in Intro to Criminal Justice, sorry, we're talking about the even weirder delinquencies, which is the in-between. And there is a good question that our textbook asks, thinking back to Aaliyah's story, which our text does that in the chapters. They reference back to the real cases. But I urge you to think about this. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge might show up later. What should be done with juveniles who are close to 18 years of age if they receive a delinquency charge? So they got a curfew charge and they're like 2 months from being 18. How should we approach that? Is that a crime that needs to be addressed? Is it a criminal crime? Is it a civil crime? Because it's a delinquency issue, does it really need to be addressed because they're going to be 18 soon and that doesn't apply? Like, how do we approach this? It's an ethical question. It's not a black and white question. There's not necessarily a one answer. So I'm just going to leave that with you to think about. Anyway, within our own system, delinquencies tend to be treated a little bit more lenient than an adult misbehavior or misdemeanor for that matter. And again, it's because we do at least take some of that idea that adolescents and children are less culpable. They kind of don't know better type of thing. So compared with adults, adolescents are believed to, quote, have a stronger preference for risk and novelty. I'm sure you can remember being a dumb kid and wanting to do something just because why the heck not? I know I did. They can be less accurate in assessing the potential consequences of risky conduct. You cannot tell me that as a young teenager, you didn't do something that was clearly really stupid and you shouldn't have done it, but you didn't think about the consequences. Be more impulsive and more concerned with short-term consequences. Oh, yeah. Have a different appreciation of time and self-control. As you get older, you look back and you're like, ooh, why did I do that? And then this is an honest one, and this comes back to a little bit of bullying, but it's not the same. Peer pressure. We talk about peer pressure. If you were a teenager in the recent past, you probably remember all these weird, awkward talks in high school about peer pressure and the dangers of peer pressure. It is a real thing, and it does lead to issues. So it's important to note that, adolescents tend to be more susceptible to peer pressure. If all your friends are doing it, they want to do it too. Even if it's stupid, even if it's wrong, even if it's dangerous. So it's just important to kind of note. There's no segue for this, but our textbook talks about this, and I do want to at least address it. And this is where I said our juvenile justice system is constantly changing and things are happening. The more liberal members of the Supreme Court, and as we've now have had a significant change in our Supreme Court justices and how that works, the more liberal side of the Supreme Court suggests that juveniles can be salvaged no matter how serious their crimes. Because the teenage brain is not fully developed, so they can't make rational decisions. We can fix them, but the more conservative side goes, oh no, they know better. They screwed up. They should be charged. It's this constant tug of war between the two sides, and not to say that there's not outliers and people in the middle, but this is where we always constantly see this struggle between hard on crime or soft on crime. And that's a different debate that goes across the board, not just for the juvenile justice system. But yeah, so one thing that our textbook talks about, and I feel is equally important to put here, and so forgive me while I move this all down and get my different pen color ready, just so I don't lose my place. We need to talk about seriousness of crime. So obviously, I don't think across the board anyone's going to make the argument that, oh, this teenager killed someone and they knew what they were doing, so oh no, they just slap on the wrist, they can go back out. I don't think most people are seeing that. I think there's a chance for rehabilitation, but I don't think it's as easy as, oh no, you're free to go. I think there's more to it. And so obviously there is this issue of the seriousness of crime. And so, in particular, our book talks about it. The term waiver, WAIVER, slash bend over, not bend over, bend over, or removal. And this whole policy, this waiver or bend over or removal, is this idea that you transfer the legal jurisdiction to the over the most serious juvenile offenders. So these murder and arson and things like that to adult courts. We've seen this happen before. Depending on how interested you've been in criminal justice and how much you keep knowledgeable of cases, perhaps one of the more unique and weird cases that I've ever read about and followed was that of the two adolescent girls who killed a third in the idea that they were making a tribute to the fake creature known as Slender Man. If you're not familiar with that case, it's very weird, but it's worth looking into. But this was a legitimate conversation. Are they tried as adults or are they tried as children? Because would an adult understand the difference between fact and fiction, reality versus fantasy? But at the same time, they did do this horrible thing, regardless of the fantasy. Like, there was a whole thing. I urge you to look into it. We actually might look at this later in the class. We might do a case study on that one, now that I'm thinking about it. Sorry, you're catching a live moment of, we might do that later. But it eventually came down to an issue of how do we address this? Is this a juvenile court case or is this an adult criminal court case? And so this would be one of those examples where the policy of waiver, where they hand it off because it's such a serious case to the adult court system. And so then the juvenile is tried as an adult. I'm sure you've heard that term before if you like crime shows and stuff like that, they use that term a lot. But yeah, just wanted to throw that out there as an important kind of piece. And I think the last thing we'll touch on here before we wrap up this video, I just want to adjust a little bit. Last thing I want to talk about is status offense. And so status offenses are, they're delinquencies, but they're not it's a whole thing. There's, how do I say it? How do I want to say this? They are not as severe. They typically don't have any kind of a impact on treatment. They are, there's very little difference between the treatment that they get, whether it's a status offense or a delinquency. But really, this is how you deal with it. So, a juvenile delinquent behavior is, burglary, shoplifting, robbery, whereas status offense is truancy, running away, disobedience. So really, status offenses are these juvenile only things. If you were an adult, these would not be things. You would not get, with a big asterisk. Obviously, if a town implements a curfew and you are an adult, yes, you can get in trouble for it. But typically, status offenses are juvenile only. These are the things that, well, you are a child, so you have to be treated in this way. But that's why I'm struggling to get this concept out, is because obviously delinquency tends to be crimes that are committed, and status offenses are crimes, but not really. It gets into that weird area. So we're gonna end it with that. I guess how I really want to end this is thinking about status offenses. If a status offense is a juvenile only issue, so there are things like curfew, their disobedience, their running away, their why do I keep forgetting the term for not being in school? There's a specific type of officer for it. Truancy. Oh my gosh, I don't know why it all of a sudden came to me. Truancy. That's a big issue. But that's a juvenile only. If there is this distinction between status offenses and delinquency, should they be dealt with in the same way? Or should we have a different system? Should status offenses be a simple rehabilitation? This is what you did wrong, this is why you can't do it. And delinquencies are, this is what you did, this is wrong, but now we need to punish and teach. Like, how should we approach it differently? Again, it's an open-ended question. I'm not expecting answers, but it's something to think about. Could there be an alternative way to handle the difference between status offenses and delinquencies? And is there a more effective way to rehabilitate a juvenile who has committed some crime, regardless of what it is? All right. Yeah, that's where I'm ending this one. The next one, like I said, we are going to end up having 3 videos. I think the third one's going to be really short. But yeah, thank you for listening through, and I'll talk to you in the next one.